Well, hello. Today we're going to talk about regulation of natural monopoly. Picking up on the last lecture on monopoly, as you recall, we have from a policy perspective that when we can have competition, we want to allow firms to compete with each other, engender competition, and allow prices to be set in an unregulated market. However, there are situations in which we have a natural monopoly. That is, it's cheaper to have one firm than numerous firms producing a meeting market demand. And we want to have those cost advantages, but we don't want the firm to price like a monopolist. So the solution is to regulate it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We have many regulatory agencies within our system of government. The state of California has the California Public Utilities Commission, which regulates the prices of PG&E and Southern California Edison. We have a city Public Utilities Commission. San Francisco's regulates the water and trash collection. And at the federal level, there's a variety of commissions. The one perhaps that is most relevant to what we're talking about today is the Federal Communication Commission, which regulated AT&T back in the days when it was a monopolist and is still serving to regulate in certain ways today. The purpose of the regulation is, like I said, to obtain the advantages of one firm having low costs. That is, it's cheaper to have one firm produce the good than lots of them, and yet not have the deleterious impact of monopoly pricing. In these situations, there are three questions that need to be asked. And what I'm going to try to get across today is that the point I'm wanting to make is that regulation of natural monopoly needs to be very fluid. You need to keep re-looking at these issues over time. You can't just decide an industry is a natural monopoly and then keep with that decision and live with it forever. These things change over time, and so you want to revisit all three of these decisions over and over again. First one is there a natural monopoly? We're going to discuss the conditions for this and then talk about some cases that have been very important in our history of how what constitutes a natural monopoly has actually changed radically over time. And then, if you know it's a natural monopoly, what price do you want the firm to charge? What is the optimal price? We've talked about optimal price in a market setting, and we're going to see that what we would really like from a social perspective need not be attainable. We might not be able to attain it. So what do we do instead? That's what that topic is about. And then, if we know that it's a natural monopoly and we know what price we want it to charge, then how do we get it to charge that price? This is an important question because usually we will know that the price we want it to charge in some generic sense. For example, social optimality occurs when price is equal to marginal cost. But if you don't know the marginal cost, you can't say what that price is. So we might be able to answer the second question by saying we want price to be equal to marginal cost. The next question becomes, how do we induce the firm to charge price equal to marginal cost? The firm knows its costs, we as the regulator don't. And so we can't set, as the regulator necessarily know, we want it to charge 2 cents per kilowatt hour or whatever the price for electricity is, 20 cents. So those are the three questions, and they all relate to each other, and the answer to them changes over time, and we need to be nimble in reacting to changes in the market to how we regulate. So the first question is, what is a natural monopoly? We've gone over this already, and I just want to review it and then talk about its implications. The main thing you do, only thing you do, is compare the minimum average cost for the firm, that's the point on their average cost curve that touches bottom where it's lowest, with market demand. And if the minimum of the average cost curve is large relative to market demand, as it is in this case, then it's better to have one firm, maybe pricing here, meeting demand, rather than have lots of firms. If you had lots of firms, each of them would have this average cost curve. This is the average cost curve for an individual firm. And if you had lots of firms, each of them producing a small share of the market, all of them would be in the higher part of their average cost curve. If you had, say, 10 firms, each of them would have to be producing about that amount to be able to all still stay in the market. Well, obviously you don't want that socially, because why would you want to have higher costs when you could have lower costs from a social perspective? That's just wasted money. Secondly, as we've described before, it's not sustainable. If any of these firms started out here, one of them happened to grow bigger than the other, for God knows what reason, that firm would then have lower costs. It would be able to undercut its competitors. They would either go out of business, or some of them might increase in size also. And eventually you'd move to where there's only, one or two firms left. So this is a case in which it's natural to have monopoly. It's in a sense inevitable to have monopoly. So we should go ahead and allow it, but not allow it to produce, price in the way that it would want to maximize profits. The other example is what we've described before, where you have the average cost curve is at a minimum at a very small level of market demand. Here you could get, it looks like, about 7 firms into the industry, and all produce a minimum of average cost. Okay, so this is the basic concept. However, when you apply the concept, you need to realize that average cost depends on the technology of production in the industry, and that changes over time. As new innovations come about, the average cost curve can change. And so something that might be a natural monopoly at one point in time, new technology comes about, changes the place where average cost is minimized, and it's no longer a natural monopoly. We don't want to keep regulating it in that case. We want to allow it to be competitive. Similarly, the demand curve can change drastically over time, and something that might be a small share of minimum cost is a small share of demand at one point in time might be a large share of demand at another point in time if demand has really dropped. So if either of those two things happen, demand changes or average cost technology changes, we want to reassess whether it's valuable to have a natural monopoly and have to regulate it. We should always try to keep competition going if we can. We should only regulate when we really have to. And so learning when we no longer have to regulate would be better. So here's an example. Telecommunications is has a long history of regulation in the United States. Going back many years, when the phones were first invented, each community had their own little phone service serving its own community. Most of them were privately owned companies, and individually for each little town. And then they started building wires between the cities to interconnect one city with another, and those were often owned by one of the two parties that were owning the company in between. This was a real headache for growth of telecommunications in the United States. It also allowed monopoly pricing in each of the individual cities and in the connection. What Congress did then was to give the monopoly power to AT&T. AT&T was one of the larger companies at the time that owned in several of these cities. Congress chose AT&T and said, you will be the monopolist for telecommunications in the United States. We will not allow, the legislation prevented other firms from trying to enter, because the idea was it's a natural monopoly. There is no need to have other firms, and in fact it would simply harm the process by increasing costs. And so we will prevent entry. AT&T, you can have the monopoly. We as the government will disallow, make it illegal for any other company to provide telecommunication services. But in return for that, AT&T had to agree to setting prices in the way that the government described. So the government set up a commission, the Federal Communication Commission, that regulated prices for AT&T. This was done under a system of wires for telecommunications. Now, of course, we've got wireless, and things have radically changed. But this is kind of a picture, and this picture shows how, I'll show you how the progress of this over time has reflected changes in demand and technology. If you're making a call on a wire landline phone, then what happens is you make your call goes through a wire from your house to a central office somewhere close by. There it's bundled up with a lot of other calls, sent to another central office, and then disbundled and sent to whatever destination. So if you're calling from Berkeley to New York City, then it goes from your house to a central office near Berkeley. Then it's sent on large cables to a central office near New York, where it's disentangled and sent back out. This is called local, this is called long distance. It's just a terminology that's used. In the beginning days of telecommunications, it was seen correctly that all of this is a natural monopoly. First of all, the loops from the individual person's house to the central office, it simply does not make sense to have more than one wire from each person's house. If you had 3 providers with 3 sets of wires, it's just 3 times as expensive. So the cost of the situation is such that it's definitely cheapest to have one company provide one wire to each person's house, but then regulate it so that it can't charge monopoly profits on that wire. So this was a natural monopoly. The long distance was a natural monopoly because, in the early days at least, there were extremely few calls being made from Berkeley to New York City, and they could all fit within one cable. So they went to a central office, got aggregated into a cable. There was one long wire that went across and interlocked with all the other cities. And I went to the central office in New York and then got disentangled. So the whole thing was a natural monopoly. It was cheapest to have one wire from each house to the central office, and it was cheapest to have one cable from each central office to each other central office. And there's no reason to have more than one firm. That was the reason for regulating AT&T, or for allowing AT&T to have the monopoly and to regulate it. Okay, well, over time, what happened? A variety of things happened in this market. The first thing that happened was an enormous increase in the demand for calls. The number of calls between New York and Berkeley and vice versa, just, as soon as people learned to make these kinds of calls, then it just expanded tremendously. So what happened first was that the demand curve shifted out tremendously. People started becoming accustomed to making these calls and relying on them and needing them, and so the demand curve shifted out. As a result, instead of just having one cable between Berkeley and New York, you started to need 2, and then a third, and then a fourth, to handle all the calls. Well, as soon as you have more than one cable, you might as well have more than one company. Why should one company own more than one cable? Instead of having 4 cables with one company, have 4 companies, and they would each be able to compete with each other then. And you wouldn't need regulation if 4 companies is enough for competition. So the first step was to deregulate long distance service and allow competition, entry and competition in the long distance market. This was primarily a recognition that the demand was so high that what used to be minimum average cost is a large share of demand was now minimum average cost is a small share of demand. The other thing that happened is there got to be different types of cables that could operate, so that changed too, but it was mainly the shift in demand. This happened starting in the late 60s, early 70s, and eventually in the 80s, AT&T was broken up. How many of y'all know about this? Remember this? AT&T had to sell off all of their local operating companies. So part of the agreement with AT&T, this was the outcome of an antitrust case against them in which the parties agreed to this. AT&T sold off the local companies that provided this part of the call and kept the long distance business. And they kept the long distance business. The Federal Communication Commission allowed other companies to enter. That's when MCI and Sprint and other companies entered for long distance. And AT&T's prices were slowly unregulated. They were no longer required to apply to the FCC for their prices. Over time, that regulation, as competition got more active, the FCC felt there was less need for regulation. So this was the first thing that went from monopoly to regulation, was long distance. These were still left as monopolies. Now, each local company was then regulated not by the federal government, the FCC generally, but by the state regulation. So the California companies were regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. That is now in a transition away from regulation to competition also. What has happened here is a change in technology. It's still cheapest to have one wire from a house to the central office, but a wire is no longer the only way you can reach a house. Now that we've got wireless telecommunications, you can reach a house exceedingly cheaply. You set the wireless company sets up the transmission device, and it can reach all the houses in the neighborhood and everyone else. So now the technology is not defined by a wire. It's not constrained to be a wire. So it could be that, so it is now that it's not necessarily cheapest to provide service with just one carrier. You could have multiple carriers providing service to each household. And that is what's happening now. The states, as they see sufficient competition from wireless communication entering the market, then they are slowly deregulating the landline phone lines for the local companies. And eventually, all of them will be deregulated. It's not that there will be alternative companies providing landline service, but the prices of landline service will be constrained by the competition with the wireless services. So they're just two different ways of providing phone service, and they definitely compete with each other. Also, how many of you get phone service through your cable TV? Yeah, it's possible. And so that's a new entrant to the market that technology has allowed. So what happened here is, from the early days of the industry, it was all a natural monopoly, and slowly over time, the parts that were no longer monopoly were seen as not being such and were allowed to move to competition. This is what we want. It's been a slow process, and usually this regulatory change has happened later than it should have happened, but that's an aspect of our regulation. One problem with regulation is that it's not nimble, and part of it is a political thing. There's a political view that if you're changing a policy, that your old policy was wrong. It's kind of, and so it's used as political ammunition against people. But no, this is not. The circumstances changed, and so the policy should change. That's what happened. Electricity is another one that we're in the middle of right now. In the early, there's generation, which is creation of the electricity. That's where you have the power plants, nuclear power plants, hydroelectric plants, and coal-powered plants mainly. And then there's transmission from those plants to the population centers, because usually the plants are not close to the population centers. And then a distribution center distribution system that brings the wire out to each person. Again, in the early days, this was all seen as a natural monopoly, as it was. The generation facilities were such that you could produce enough electricity that you only needed a few of them or one of them for a population center. The transmission lines were, you only needed a few transmission lines to be able to, or one to each population center. And the distribution was the same thing as with phones. Why have more than one wire to a person's house to bring them electricity? It's better to just have one. So again, it started out with complete natural monopoly. Over time, we moved towards a system where we recognized that generation was no longer a natural monopoly, that the population centers have grown so much and the demand for electricity has grown so much and the technology for electricity has changed such that now a power plant provides only part of the electricity that's needed by any group of population center. There are hundreds of power plants in California. So there's no reason for one company to own them all. So what has happened was, in the late 1890s, the power companies were required to sell off their generation facility, and all the generation was owned by private parties, and they sold it to the central exchange, the PX it's called, Power Exchange, and which was the wholesale market for electricity. Transmission and distribution was still seen as being a natural monopoly and was still retained. So if you look on your PG&E bill, you can see that there's a price for the actual electricity itself, but then there's added cost for the transmission and distribution. PG&E buys its electricity from the power exchange and passes that cost through, and so that's competitive. and transmission and distribution are still regulated. We have retreated a bit in this regard. What happened was in, was it year 2000? We had a shortage of electricity and huge spikes in wholesale prices, and PG&E in Southern California, Edison, practically went broke, because at that point they were having to pay the wholesale price at the exchange, but they were still regulated on what they could charge customers, and so they were losing money tremendously. And as a result, the regulation changed such that they were able to buy back some of their generation facilities. The rules were changed. There's a whole lot of changes, but there's been a kind of retreat from that. I personally think that was an inappropriate response to it. It was a kind of panicked response. It is true, generation is not a natural monopoly. It should not be treated as a regulated industry anymore. It should be allowed to be competitive. Transmission, we also could perhaps by now start moving towards competitive transmission, because we have many, many transmission lines going through California. Distribution might be I say transmission is a natural monopoly. I've actually changed my mind on that. I think it need not be anymore. And then distribution, again, you still want to have only one wire going to each person, but if you've got a cable connection, how about letting the cable company provide electricity too? I don't know if we'd want that, but the point here is you want to keep thinking about these issues. It's not a matter of just setting up a commission to regulate the industry and then just staying with that. You want to see how the how the industry changes over time. Yeah. Wholesale prices did not drop. They rose, and I think the basic problem was, and this might be endemic. I mean, again, I don't want to push my view on this. The problem was a main aspect of an effective competitive system is free entry, and building of new generation facilities in California is exceedingly difficult. Free entry is definitely not the case. So one approach could have been to try to create more, reduce the barriers to entry for electricity generation. But the response instead was to retreat back into regulation. Natural monopoly and free entry are two different things. It would be each firm, each generation facility produces a small share of the market demand, and so it's not a natural monopoly. But as demand increases with the given number of facilities, the response that you need of new facilities entering at the minimum of their average cost doesn't occur. So those are two separate issues. I want everyone to be able to think of this in your own terms and not feel constrained in anything I say. It's quite reasonable to think that because there's, even without a natural monopoly, if there's not free entry and it's an essential good, the best response might be to regulate. Maybe. Okay, now we know that there's a natural monopoly. Let's say we've gone through that first set of discussions and decided we want to have there is a natural monopoly, and so we're going to regulate it. The question then becomes, what do we want the regulated firm to do? What is optimal? We have already learned in this class that social optimality is obtained when price is equal to marginal cost. Each firm buys goods as long as their marginal willingness to pay exceeds this, such that on the margin their last unit is equal to this or just a little higher. And each firm produces until the marginal cost is equal to that willingness to pay. So that's best from a social perspective. The problem is, in a natural monopoly setup, you will often have that outcome result in the firm losing money. This is a situation where average cost is decreasing continuously. This might occur if you've got an enormous power plant, and the more you produce, it costs a lot to build it, like a nuclear power plant costs a tremendous amount to build, but then the cost on the margin is extremely low. And so all that's happening, what mainly is happening, is your fixed costs get amortized over more and more units, and so your average cost keeps dropping down towards marginal cost. It might not ever actually touch marginal cost, it just keep continuously down, at least for the area of demand here. Well, if we induce the firm to price at what's socially optimal right here, then we would be forcing the firm to lose money. The firm would be pricing below its average cost and go out of business. The entrepreneurs would choose to take their money elsewhere and take their time elsewhere, and you can't legally force people to invest in things they don't want to, so they would simply go out of business. We have to do something in this situation. There are two solutions that have been put forward. In Europe, generally the solution is to actually subsidize the firm for the loss. So to pay the company for whatever loss it sees. There are two reasons against this. This is not what the United States does. There are two reasons against it. One, if you pay someone's loss, the loss is going to get bigger and bigger. If I ask you, how much did you lose last month? I'll write you a check for it. What would you tell me? $2-3 million? Oh no, I think it was 10 million. You know, it's a formula for ever increasing losses. The second thing is that money has to come from somewhere. And to be able to get the money, a tax has to be placed on something. Tax on income, tax on land, tax on something. The government has to get the money to pay this subsidy. And what that tax does is then push price away from marginal cost in some other market. As we've seen, a tax always brings in less revenue than the harm it does to consumers and producers. And so it pushes us away from social optimality somewhere else. So it actually doesn't allow us to be at social optimality. It just changes where that lack of optimality is. Instead of occurring in the regulated industry, it's occurring in whatever industry the prices are collected. So this is a possible solution, but it's not the one the United States has pursued. What in the United States we've done is to instead go to what's called second best, which is the lowest price possible, consistent with the firm not losing money, average cost. So in this case, this is where it would like to be, and we simply retreat back to the second best price, which is the lowest price possible, with the firm not breaking even. Now, second best is not defined as price equal average cost. It's defined as the lowest price possible that, or the closest to first best that allows the firm to not lose money. So for example, where did I have that one? This one. The way I've drawn this is actually not a very usual situation, but if I've drawn this, the marginal cost curve would go through the minimum of average cost and hit band right about here. There, if we priced at the first best, the firm would make a profit. It would not lose money. And that would then be first best and second best. The second best is the closest to first best you can get without the first firm losing money, and that's what that would be. So in that case, second best and first best are one and the same. Usually though, the average cost curve in a natural monopoly is downward sloping the whole way, and the firm would lose money. So that's what we want the firm to do. Now the problem is, again, how do we induce this? If we want the firm to price at average cost, we know that as a general rule, that's a formula, price at average cost, but how do you implement it in the real world? The problem is the regulator who is trying to induce the firm to price at average cost doesn't know what the demand curve is and doesn't know what the cost curve is. Particularly doesn't know what the costs of production are. They're not the people who run the firm who know those costs. And importantly, the firm has no reason to tell the regulator what the costs are. This isn't because because the firm is evil in any way. What do we do in economics? We examine people's self-interest. People act in accordance with what's good for themselves. A firm has an incentive in this situation to deceive the regulator, to tell them that their costs are different than they actually are. Again, if someone asks you, you're producing a product, and you're told, you can charge any price that's your average cost. I'll allow you to charge whatever your average cost is. What's your average cost? Well, you'll say, well, it's $3,000. You're going to answer with a price that's high enough to give you a very large profit. That's your own profit motive. That's just inevitable. So the firm is not doing anything different than a competitive firm or a monopoly or anything else. It's simply acting in its self-interest. But its self-interest is not to be honest with the regulator. And the important thing about self-interest is the firm doesn't even need to know that it's being dishonest. The entrepreneurs, they might think that their costs are extremely high. It's amazing how self-interest and your view of reality start jiving. And so, it's quite possible for the firms to think that they're being honest and yet end up with costs that are very different than their actual costs. So in the light of that, how do we go about regulating the firms? There's historically been two types of regulation. The first one I'm going to describe is rate of return regulation. This has been used for many, many years. One of the major advances of economics was to show the problems with this type of regulation. It's a type of regulation that sounds very sensible and yet gives incentives to the firm that are deleterious. And then there's another type of regulation that in many contexts can be used instead that does give the correct incentives. Rate of return regulation, that's called price cap regulation. So we're going to get to that next. In rate of return regulation, this is what has been used historically in all business and all regulation until the last 20 years. It started shifting in the last 20 years. The problem with natural monopoly, or with a monopolist, is that they charge a higher price than is socially optimal, even second best optimality, and they make, as a result of that, higher profits than they would at what's social optimal. What the rate of return regulation does is respond to that by saying, we as the regulators will allow the firm to only make a fair return on their investment in time. So the fair return, the regulator will set at, say, 6%, 8%, whatever it thinks is a fair return on the capital invested. And then the firm can set whatever price it wants, as long as at the end of the year it doesn't end up making more than a 6% return on its money. If the firm ends up making more than 6%, then the price the next year has to be lowered to give that money back to consumers, essentially. This sounds very sensible, doesn't it? It sounds like you're directly attacking the problem. The problem is the firm's charging too high a price, making too high a profit. We're going to allow it only to make a fair profit and price whatever it wants as long as it only makes a fair profit, and regulate it in that fashion. The problem with this is that it gives perverse incentives to the firm under practically any setup. So the regulator defines what return is fair, say 6%, 8%. The prices are set to give that return. I'm going to start at the middle one here. The regulator doesn't know what rate of return is actually required by the entrepreneurs to make them willing to provide their capital but no more. What economists call the true needed necessary return. This is what would be included in the average cost. As I've said before, this in a competitive market, we don't need to ever calculate it, because firms enter if the return is higher than that and leave when it's lower than that, and it just ends up at that. We don't need to calculate it. But here we do. So suppose that the entrepreneur's actual reserve price for capital, what they are willing to provide capital for, is 6%, and the regulator sets it at 8%. So the regulator just happened to be off, just giving them too much money. What does that do? That means that the price is going to be greater than average cost, and each person is going to be paying more than they need to. But more importantly, the entrepreneurs then have an incentive to overcapitalize the firm, use too much capital. If you were in a situation where you could borrow money at 6% and earn it at 8%, what would you do? You would borrow as much as you possibly can and get that 2% extra. And so what happens here is the opportunity cost to the entrepreneurs of the money is 6%. You can think of that as what they could get elsewhere or what they could borrow the money for, and yet they're being allowed to make more. And so they're going to want to invest as much as they possibly can. It becomes an infinite money-making machine. The only thing that stops them is eventually the price gets pushed up so high that they're back to where their monopoly price was without regulation, and then they'll stop. But as long as they're allowed to make an excess profit off of their capital, it's just like all forms of entry. They want more of it. And so if the regulator makes a mistake and allows too much capital, too much return on capital, the firm will be over-invested in capital, and we as the population will be paying for it because of inefficient use of capital, from that inefficient use of capital. When I worked with AT&T on their monopolization case many years ago, and they were an amazing example of this. They had the most lavish offices. Their offices for secretaries were more lavish than most business executives here in San Francisco. They had helicopters that would take people from New Jersey over to Manhattan, and at lunch, the mid-level executives would talk about who gets to ride the helicopter that day to go over to Manhattan. This is what happens. I mean, it's not just theory. It actually happened. And, of course, people who pay for the phone service are the ones that we're paying for it. If the fair rate of return exceeds the true cost of capital, there's going to be excessive use of capital and a waste as a result of that. Suppose the regulator does the opposite and allows too little capital, or too little return on capital, sets the rate of return at 4% when it's actually 6%. What that means is the entrepreneurs will take their money out. If their opportunity cost is 6%, they don't want to keep making 4%. And insofar as they can take their money out, as soon as it becomes able to take money out, they will, and the monopoly will become insolvent. It will essentially become a crisis. The regulator then, of course, will respond to that by raising the rate of return, and you get back up into this situation. So here, if you realize the regulator is never going to let the firm just essentially go out of business, this situation will happen maybe for a short period of time, entrepreneurs taking their capital out and the firm becoming insolvent, until you bounce back up to this one, and then it's overcapitalized. You might think that, okay, so what you've got is, if this is the true, you get above it, you got problems, below it, you got problems. What if you're just right at it? Well, first of all, the chance of being exactly right are infinitesimal, and it just doesn't happen. You can't know exactly what the entrepreneur's rate of return is. So the chances of that are extremely small. But even if it did happen, what it means is that the entrepreneurs are then making simply a break-even rate of return. They could care less if costs are minimized or not. If they waste in the production process, it doesn't matter because they get to cover their costs. They become essentially indifferent to all possible outcomes, and it doesn't serve to reduce costs. So this situation, there's no incentive to minimize costs. They might minimize costs, but they might not. These two situations, they have an active incentive to have the wrong costs. This is too much capital, too little capital. So the best you can do is highly unlikely, which is to get it. And even then, you don't have any incentive to reduce costs. Yeah. This is exactly the problem. He's raising the question. I'll repeat it. If the firm minimized its cost at price equal AC, they would they would then make higher profits because they've got lower costs. No. What happens under rate of return regulation? If at the end of the year they're making more than the rate of return that's allowed, they have to give it back the next year. So they have no incentive to reduce their costs. That's the problem. You either have no incentive to reduce your costs to minimum cost, or you have an active incentive to overcapitalize or undercapitalize. Essentially, you end up with regulation causing tremendous amounts of excess cost in one way or another. And this has been documented over and over and over. There's been a whole long literature on the benefits of deregulation and the harm that regulation has done because of this. I've got a book on this called Optimal Regulation. If any of y'all want to, you can go to my website. It's online, free, if you want to read it. So now what we want to do is to try to set up a type of regulation that doesn't provide perverse incentives. It's exceedingly difficult. It sounds easy to regulate a firm. Let's regulate the firm. It always sounds easy to do that, but it's exceedingly difficult. This is why you want to bring about competition if it's ever possible, so you don't have to deal with these. The type of regulation that has been adopted the most readily that solves some of the problems with rate of return regulation is called price cap regulation. The commission sets a price. Usually this is done after a period of rate of return regulation. So it's usually a transition type, it's a transition away from another type of regulation. So maybe the price of electricity was 10 cents per kilowatt hour. The commission says you can charge 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And the firm is allowed to charge any price it wants to that's equal to or below that cap, and it gets to keep whatever profits it wants, whatever profit it earns. And then over time, oops, don't have the thing. Over time, the regulator will change this price cap by a predetermined formula. Like it'll go down 2% a year, or it'll go down by some index, or something like that. Why is this advantageous? What it does is induce the firm to choose to minimize costs. Instead of setting the fair rate of return and allowing the firm to charge whatever price it wants, but if it makes too much profit, it has to give it back, instead, the regulator is setting the price directly and then letting the firm earn whatever profits it can earn. So this is exactly, what's your name? Max was saying, in this case, a firm that is charging a price, if it can lower its costs, it will do so, and it gets to keep the profit. Okay? So this will induce the firm to minimize its costs in every period, in the periods. What is problematic with this? This is only a partial solution. Again, there is no good solution in this situation. The partial solution, it's only a partial solution for two reasons. First of all, the only people that benefit is the firm. If the firm reduces its price, its costs, it gets to keep that profit. Consumers are still left with the same price. And so the impact of competition, which is to reduce costs to minimum costs, reduce prices to the lowest possible, and consumers get all the benefits, consumers aren't getting any benefit from this additional regulation. It's the fact that the firm gets to keep the profit is what provides it the incentive. The only way that has been dealt with is for over time, the regulator to change the price cap over time, lowering the price cap. And that will work for a certain number of years. But what if you set a policy of reducing the price cap 5% a year? Well, eventually the price is going to become lower than the minimum average cost, and the firm will go out of business. Okay? But now how do you know, as the regulator, when you've reached that point? If you ask the firm, they'll tell you we've already reached it. And if you look at the profits of the firm, and if the profits of the firm are negative, you allow it to raise its price a little, or if it's making a lot of profit, you keep lowering the price. That simply becomes rate of return regulation in another form. Just lagged a little period. So this is a good type of regulation for a transition from rate of return regulation to a short-term transition where we can set the prices at what they were before and lower them a little bit each year to transfer some of the reduced costs to consumers. But it's not a long-term solution. As soon as you start getting into continually reducing the price and not knowing when it's going to hit minimum of average cost, it essentially becomes a disguised form of rate of return regulation. This is where we are in the profession right now. We've had price cap regulation, and it has had a tremendously beneficial effect. But we don't know where to go from now. We're now at the point where the regulators are looking to the firm's profits to see how to set price of the next year, which again is a form of rate of return regulation. Your generation has many things you can solve. If you could solve this, you would get a Nobel Prize. No doubt about it. Okay, thank you. Have fun on the midterm on Wednesday.